Hey everybody, welcome to the Bitter Pill, the show where we talk about bitter pills of truth that people often don't want to swallow and that the corporate media doesn't want us to know exist. Uh, Today we're going to talk about law and order. You often hear people speak about the importance of law and order, quote unquote. When citizens fight for some sort of social change, it's claimed, they need to follow legal channels or the result will be chaos, it's said. So you have to vote, for example. And if the majority support the change that you're voting for, it will happen. Lobby our elected officials, and if our arguments are compelling, it will happen. This is a sort of argument that a fellow YouTuber I know, and I won't mention any names, I'm not trying to single anyone out, but he made this argument regarding the recent spate of protesters pulling down statues of slave owners and Grant and Theodore Roosevelt and so forth. And so the argument's basically, there's a slippery slope where if you're too disruptive and you don't follow the official channels for effecting change, then society will descend into chaos. Now, there's several difficulties of various sorts with this notion that we have to stick to the official channels or the result will be chaos. We'll slide down the slippery slope. First of all, it overlooks how corrupt our political system is, making it very, very difficult to bring about change through the civil, quote-unquote, democratic route. First of all, campaign financing is rigged. Voting is rigged. The counting of the vote is rigged. Voters' right to vote is suppressed on a massive scale. So, we can't necessarily get elected officials in power who will listen to us. And in fact, the last 3 out of 5 presidential elections, 2000, 2004, and 2016, the candidate who should have won the election was cheated out of it as a result of voter suppression and rigging of the vote count and so forth. I can cite sources on that if you'd like further information. Also, media discussion of politics is so biased, as we discuss on this channel quite a bit. People may not necessarily have the information they need to understand why certain changes need to be made, or a lot of people may not. And also, many states don't have a system where citizens can vote on ballot measures. They have to rely on the goodwill of elected officials who may not have their best interests in mind because of various things I mentioned before. So our ability to affect change through official channels is actually very limited if we only follow that route. Second of all, this notion that unless we proceed through official channels rather than engage in rabble-rousing or civil disobedience, society is going to descend into chaos. Really, it's one hell of a straw man, to be honest. People have been engaged in quite often disruptive and militant efforts to challenge this aspect of this or that aspect of the status quo, going all the way back to the founding of this country, when of course the status quo was that the U.S. Didn't exist. There were 13 colonies of Britain, and so there was quite a battle, a lot of civil disobedience leading up to the Revolutionary War to bring about the change known as the founding of the United States. Of course, in the next century, there was massive social disruption around the effort to get rid of slavery, ultimately culminating in the Civil War. But notably, the result of that was that slavery was abolished and society did not descend into chaos. Unfortunately, racial oppression was not abolished. It continues to this day, but slavery was, and we didn't have chaos. Look at other examples. The fight for enfranchisement of women, women's suffrage, the fight against bigotry against gay people, battles against capitalist impoverishment of working people, the massive civil disobedience that took place in the 1930s, strikes and boycotts and all sorts of other, rent strikes, all sorts of other measures. You name it, throughout the entire history of this country, there has been massive rabble-rousing, and society has never descended into utter chaos. And, the other thing that this claim overlooks is, in lots of cases, how on earth are people supposed to gain justice if, in fact, they are the minority? Or if they're perhaps like women, a majority, but in a relatively powerless or a very powerless position as women were before they had the right to vote. Would the slaves have been freed if it were up to white citizens in the mid-1800s to vote on whether or not to continue slavery, which is actually something that was advocated by presidential candidate Henry Clay, who was the quote-unquote lesser evil in 1844 because he wanted to put slavery up to a vote rather than just saying, we have slavery, period. He was a slave owner himself, by the way. Would gay people have won civil rights if it had just been put up to a vote in 1969 when the Stonewall riots happened and the gay rights movement, involving decades of struggle, really took off? Because fewer than 4% of the population is lesbian, gay, or bisexual. So do you think people in 1969 would have voted to grant civil rights to gay people? I don't think so. Would black people in the South have been able to overturn discrimination laws through voting? Well, no, they generally couldn't vote. Would they have been able to do so by just asking legislators nicely, please give us civil rights? No. So often, those who are victims of injustice are in the minority. Or if they're in the majority, as in the case of women, they're a relatively powerless majority. True democracy is not equivalent to majority rule, contrary to popular belief, because sometimes the rule of the majority can, in fact, be a tyranny of the majority, as was the case with the dominance of society by men, particularly wealthy men, during the early years of our country, and the oppression of the majority, women. And thanks to our biased corporate media and the typically status quo maintaining nature of our culture, the majority is often uninformed or unaware about the issue at hand. So they don't recognize the need for change. So in order to start educating people, you have to get their attention. And that's part of why protest, perhaps even civil disobedience of an illegal nature, is often key to effecting change. Now, the topic of this video is not to prove to you that civil disobedience works. That's a topic for another show, and I will do that soon. I want to focus here on just more the moral side of rabble-rousing and the immorality of the mentality that says, we must have law and order, we must obey our government leaders and authority figures. But rather than reinvent the wheel, I'd like to read you a few passages written about this topic of law and the fight for justice by one of my favorite writers, historian Howard Zinn, because he does an outstanding job of addressing this topic. And this is from an essay called Law and Justice from his outstanding book, Declarations of Independence, which I highly recommend that you read. But I'm going to read part of this chapter to you because I think it's really outstanding stuff. So Howard says, in 1978, I was teaching a class called Law and Justice in America. which is the title of this chapter, Law and Justice. And on the first day, I handed out the course outline. At the end of the hour, one of the students came up to the desk. He was a little older than the others. He said, "I notice in your course outline that you'll be discussing the case of the U.S. versus O'Brien. When we come to that, I would like to say something about it." I was a bit surprised, Howard said, but glad that a student would take such initiative. I said, "Sure. What's your name?" He said, "O'Brien, David O'Brien." It was indeed his case. On the morning of March 31st, 1966, while American troops were pouring into Vietnam and U.S. planes were bombing day and night, David O'Brien and 3 friends climbed the steps of the courthouse in South Boston where they lived, a mostly Irish working-class neighborhood, held up their draft registration cards before a crowd that had assembled, and set the cards afire. According to Chief Justice Earl Warren, who rendered the Supreme Court decision in this case, immediately after the burning, members of the crowd began attacking O'Brien, and he was ushered to safety by an FBI agent. FBI agents then pulled him into the courthouse, threw him into a closet, and gave him a few blows as they arrested him. Chief Justice Warren's decision said, "O'Brien stated to FBI agents that he had burned his registration certificate because of his beliefs, knowing that he was violating federal law. His intention was clear. He wanted to express to the community his strong feelings about the war in Vietnam, trying to call attention by a dramatic act to the mass killing our government was engaged in there. The burning of his draft card would get special attention precisely because it was against the law, and so he would risk imprisonment to make his statement." O'Brien claimed in court that his act, although in violation of the draft law, was protected by the free speech provision of the Constitution, which, indeed it is. But the Supreme Court decided that the government's need to regulate the draft overcame his right to free expression, and so he was sent to prison. O'Brien had engaged in an act of civil disobedience, the deliberate violation of a law for a social purpose. To violate a law for individual gain, for a private purpose, is an ordinary criminal act, not civil disobedience. But some acts fall into both categories, as is in the case of a mother stealing bread to feed her children, for example. Although limited to one family's need, such acts carry a larger message to society about its failures. In either instance, the law is being disobeyed, which sets up strong emotional currents in a population that has been taught obedience from childhood. So, as I'll discuss on another occasion, you often get mass societal disapproval of acts of civil disobedience that, in fact, appear to lead to change. Obedience and disobedience. Obey the law. That is a powerful teaching, often powerful enough to overcome deep feelings of right and wrong, even to override the fundamental instinct for personal survival. We learn very early, because it's not in our genes, that we must obey the, quote, law of the land. Skipping ahead a little bit. The dominant ideology leaves no room for making intelligent and humane distinctions about the obligation to obey the law. It is stern and absolute. It is the unbending rule of every government, whether fascist, communist, or liberal capitalist. Gertrude Schultz-Klink, chief of the Women's Bureau under Hitler, explained to an interviewer after the war the Jewish policy of the Nazis. "We always obeyed the law. Isn't that what you do in America? Even if you don't agree with the law personally, you still obey it. Otherwise, life would be chaos." Sounds familiar. Life would be chaos. If we allow disobedience to law, we will have anarchy. That idea is inculcated in a population of every country. The accepted phrase in English-speaking countries is law and order. It is a phrase that sends police and the military to break up demonstrations everywhere, whether in Moscow or Chicago. It was behind the killing of 4 students at Kent State University in 1970 by National Guardsmen. It is a phrase that has appeal for most citizens who, unless they themselves have a powerful grievance against authority, are afraid of disorder. In the 1960s, a student at Harvard Law School addressed parents and alumni with these words: "The streets of our country are in turmoil. The universities are filled with students rebelling and rioting. Communists are seeking to destroy our country. Russia is threatening us with her might. And the republic is in danger. Yes, danger from within and without. We need law and order. Without law and order, our nation cannot survive. There was prolonged applause from the students and alumni and parents. When the applause died down, the student quietly told his listeners, these words were spoken in 1932 by, can you guess, Adolf Hitler. Surely peace, stability, and order are desirable. Chaos and violence are not. But stability and order are not the only desirable conditions of social life. There is also justice, meaning the fair treatment of all human beings, the equal right of all people to freedom and prosperity. Absolute obedience to the law may bring order temporarily, but it may not bring justice. And when it does not, those treated unjustly may protest, may rebel, may cause disorder, as the American revolutionaries did in the 18th century, as anti-slavery people did in the 19th century, as people involved in many social movements have done since then, as working people have done, going on strike in every country across the centuries. Are we not more obligated to achieve justice than to obey the law? The law may serve justice, as when it forbids rape and murder, or requires a school to admit all students, regardless of race or nationality. But when it sends young men to war, when it protects the rich and punishes the poor, then law and justice are opposed to one another. In that case, where is our greater obligation, to law or to justice? The answer is given in democratic theory at its best, in the words of Jefferson and his colleagues in the Declaration of Independence. Law is only a means. Government is only a means. Quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the ends. And, quote, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. So, should we worry that disobedience to law will lead to anarchy? The answer is best given by historical experience. Did the mass demonstrations of the black movement in the American South in the early 60s lead to anarchy? Or did the various other examples that I gave you earlier lead to chaos and disorder on any sort of lasting basis? Nope. Rather, the result was a healthy reconstitution of the social order toward greater justice and a healthy new understanding of Americans, not all of course, about the need for racial equality in the example that Howard gave. Okay, so he goes on to talk about obligation to the state and talks about a supposed dialogue between Socrates and the state of Greece that was planning to execute him. And Plato just completely made this up to serve his own political views and interests. But it lays out the argument for the folks who think that we must obey the state, we must obey the law, otherwise we're going to descend into chaos. Plato, the Western world's star intellectual, makes a number of paltry arguments in this so-called dialogue. He has Socrates imagine the authorities addressing him. What complaint have you against us in the state that you are trying to destroy us? Are we not, first of all, your parents? Through us your father took your mother and brought you into the world. What complaint? Only that they are putting him to death. The state as parents. Now we understand those words. The motherland, the fatherland, the founding fathers, Uncle Sam. That's where those phrases come from. They're catchphrases that we've been sort of trained to look at as reasons why we should obey the government. What neat spades for planting the idea of obligation. It's not some little junta of military men and politicians who are sending you to die in some muddy field in Asia or Central America. It's your mother or your father's favorite brother. How can you say no? To rest, your father took your mother and brought you into the world. What stately arrogance, Howard says. But instead, he says, why not insist that the state persuade us to do its bidding? There is no equality in Plato's scheme. The citizen may use persuasion, but no more. The state may use first. So the obligation only goes one way, even though we supposedly created the government to serve us, and politicians are supposedly our employees. It seems that the idea of owing, of obligation, is strongly felt by almost everyone. But what does one owe the government? Granted, the government may do useful things for its citizens, but because the government administers programs for which citizens pay taxes and for which government officials draw salaries, does that mean that you owe your government your life? If, for example, there's a war? Now, Plato is enticing us to confuse the country with the government. Socrates' position, or that attributed to him by Plato, that he must accept death for his disobedience. He was sentenced to death for some law that he disobeyed, has become one of the cardinal principles in the liberal philosophy of civil disobedience, in part, of the dominant American orthodoxy in the United States for both conservatives and liberals. It is usually stated this way: it's your right to break the law when your conscience is offended, but then you must accept your punishment. Why? Howard asks. Why agree to be punished when you think you have acted rightly, and the law, punishing you for that, has acted wrongly? Why is it all right to disobey the law in the first instance, but then when you're sentenced to prison, you start obeying that very same law? Some people, to support the idea of accepting punishment, like to quote Martin Luther King, one of the great apostles of civil disobedience. In his letter from Birmingham City Jail, written in the spring of 1963, in the midst of tumultuous demonstrations against racial segregation, King said, I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustices is in reality expressing the very highest respect for the law. But Howard goes on to say, I believe King's reply has been seriously misinterpreted. It was an impassioned defense of nonviolent direct action, but it was obvious that he wanted to persuade conservative church leaders of his moderation. He was anxious to show that while committing civil disobedience, he was expressing the very highest respect for law. But the law that, quote unquote, that King respected, we know unquestionably from his life, his work, and his philosophy, was not man-made law, neither segregation laws, nor even laws approved by the Supreme Court, nor decisions of the courts, nor sentence meted out by judges. He meant respect for the higher law, the law of morality, of justice. To be one who willingly accepts punishment is not the same as thinking it right to be punished for an act of conscience. If this were so, why would King agree to be released from jail by behind-the-scenes pressure, as he did in 1960, when a mysterious benefactor in a high position, someone close to President-elect Kennedy, pulled strings to get him out of prison? King talks about staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice. He does not speak of staying in jail because he owes that to the government, as Plato, speaking for Socrates, maintained. Not at all. He remains in jail not for philosophical or moral reasons, but for a practical purpose, to continue the struggle to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice. Would King have condemned slaves who were tried under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 in order to return to slavery, but refused to give themselves up and ran away from their sentence? And he gives several other examples. No, of course he would not. During the Vietnam War, the Catholic priest Daniel Berrigan committed an act of civil disobedience along with 8 other men and women. They entered a draft board in Catonsville, Maryland, removed draft records, and set them afire in a public ceremony. One of those involved Mary Moylan, along with Daniel Berrigan, fled from the law. Moylan was never apprehended. She wrote from underground, "I don't want to see people marching off to jail with smiles on their faces. I just don't want to see them going. I don't want to waste the sisters and brothers we have by marching them off to jail." Berrigan and Moylan thought the war was wrong and thought their going to jail for opposing it was wrong. If, like King, they felt it would serve some practical purpose, then they probably would have accepted it, quote unquote. Going to jail can make a certain kind of statement to the public. Yes, I feel so strongly about what is happening in the world that I'm willing to risk jail to express my feelings. Refusing to go to jail makes a different kind of statement. The system that sentenced me is the same foul system that is carrying on this war. I will defy it to the end. It does not deserve my allegiance. So, Howard posits that Martin Luther King, despite his words in letter from Birmingham jail, would very much have agreed with the sentiments expressed by Berrigan and Moylan, that it's okay to resist arrests as a result of an unjust law or enforcement of an unjust law. The idea behind "accept your punishment," quote unquote, advanced often by, quote, liberals sympathetic with dissent, is that whenever your disagreement with some specific law or some particular policy, whatever your disagreement with that, you should not spread disrespect for the law in general, because we need respect for the law to keep society intact. That's the inference. This is like saying that because apples are good for children, we must insist that they not refuse the rotten ones, because that might lead them to reject all apples. Well, good apples are good for your health, and rotten apples are bad. Bad laws and bad policies endanger our lives and our freedoms. Why can't we trust human intelligence to make the proper distinctions among laws as among apples? Most people quickly accept the idea of disobedience in a totalitarian society, or in a blatantly undemocratic situation, such as the American South under segregation. But I look differently at breaking the law in a liberal society, where parties compete for the votes of citizens, where laws are passed by bodies of elected representatives, and where people have some opportunities for free expression of ideas. What this argument misses is that civil disobedience gives an intensity to expression by its dramatic violation of law, which other means, voting, speaking, and writing, do not possess. If we are to avoid majority tyranny over oppressed minorities, we must give a dissident minority a way of expressing the fullness of its grievance. The fire editor of the abolitionist newspaper in Boston, William Lloyd Garrison, understood the need. Criticized by another anti-slavery person for his strong language and his dramatic actions, such as setting fire to a copy of the Constitution at a public demonstration to call attention to the Constitution's support for slavery, Garrison replied, "Sir, slavery will not be overthrown without excitement, a most tremendous excitement." Protest beyond the law is not a departure from democracy. It is absolutely essential to it, Howard says. It is a corrective to the sluggishness of the proper channels, a way of breaking through passages blocked by tradition and prejudice. It is disruptive and troublesome, but it is a necessary disruption, a healthy troublesomeness. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed that little passage from Howard Zinn's book, Declarations of Independence. I think it beautifully makes the point that civil disobedience, far from being a threat to civil order, to law and order, is a necessary part of advancing justice in society. Okay, well, that's all for this episode of The Bitter Pill. I will put a link to the reference to Howard's book down below. and whatever else I think of that might be relevant that you might want to look up. And I will see you next time.